Hey guys, tonight we drift into a blurred horizon of seafoam mist and jagged stone, your footsteps soft on slick cobblestones as gull cries echo just beyond hearing. You feel the brine tickle your nostrils and the wind tug at your hair, nudging you toward a time when the Celtic world whispered of creatures, stirring beneath those gray waves. You're not actually standing on a cliff in the Hebrides, but if you're anything like me, you'll pretend you are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to sail into ancient myths and gentle mysteries. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments if you'd like to share where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slip into the Celtic mist. You begin by tracing a worn path carved into the rock face above a secluded inlet, where the Atlantic surf hisses and sighs below. The salt spray feels cool against your skin, and every so often you catch the glint of sunlight on water, like a dragon's eye peeking through the waves. In reality, Celtic seafarers built sturdy curraghs, simple boats made of animal skin stretched over wooden frames, to navigate these very waters, often using only the sun and stars for guidance. You can almost taste the tar used to seal the hulls, sticky and oddly sweet in the air as the boat rocked gently beneath an early morning sky. As you continue, you notice faded carvings etched into the cliffside, serpentine figures curling around Ogham inscriptions. These primitive scripts, dating as far back as the 4th century CE, served as boundary markers or memorials, a tactile record of lives long swallowed by time. You run your fingertips over the rough stone, picturing ancient hands doing the same. It's a mainstream historical fact that Ogham served as the earliest written form of the Irish language, inscribed mostly on standing stones scattered across Ireland and western Britain. But here, in this hidden cove, the serpents seem alive, as though they might unfurl at any moment and slip into the churning sea, every now and then. A rogue wave crashes against the rocks, sending a cool mist over you. You shake your head, a playful attempt to clear away any notion of real danger. After all, these legends were never about terror, they were lullabies in another form, told to fishermen to keep them vigilant yet calm. Historians still argue whether the serpents were originally symbols of local deities or merely artistic flourishes that later became tales of living beasts. Either way, you find yourself leaning closer to the carvings, tracing the curves and imagining fins flicking beneath the surface. A solitary cormorant perches on a jagged rock below, preening its feathers. You notice a slim strand of seaweed tangled at the tip of its beak, a quirky tidbit passed down in coastal lore. Some islanders believed these birds collected sea dragon scales to weave into feathers, giving them their glossy sheen. You chuckle softly. The notion of a bird crafting its own dragon-derived wardrobe feels like a bedtime fairy tale, but you tuck it away as a charming possibility. The cliffside path narrows, and tufts of heather brush your ankles, releasing a faint, sweet aroma. You pause, inhaling the scent, letting it mingle with the salt tang. In the distance, you hear the faint clanging of a bell, likely from a small chapel hidden in a nearby village high above the cliffs. The monks there, centuries ago, would ring in the dawn to bless fishermen before they launched into the sea, praying for safe passage through waters said to be guarded by ancient, slumbering dragons. As the sun lowers, casting an auburn glow across the water, you spot an archway hollowed into the rock. It leads deep into the cliff, the entrance just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. Maybe it was once a hermit's cell, or perhaps a shrine carved out by early Christian settlers. Some rumor it predated their arrival, a druidic sanctum honoring the sea spirits. Regardless, you crouch and step inside, the rough stone walls closing in like the hull of a curragh, guiding you deeper into shadow. Inside, torchlight flickers across damp walls decorated with more serpent carvings, these ones appearing in pairs, heads raised as if confronting each other. Moss and barnacles cling to the lower edges, proof of occasional tidal flooding. You run your fingers along the groove of one serpent's spine, feeling the cool, uneven bumps. The monks who later occupied similar coastal caves often painted crosses over pre-Christian symbols to claim spiritual dominion. Yet here, no crosses mar the serpentine art, suggesting these images were consciously preserved, perhaps out of reverence rather than fear. A gentle drip echoes somewhere above, and you tilt your head back to see a narrow shaft of light slicing through the ceiling, a reminder that you're never truly in darkness. It's both comforting and eerie, a dual sensation you've grown to love in these explorations. You shift your weight, mindful that you might be disturbing nesting swallows or bats, but your footsteps are muffled by centuries of accumulated silt. As you reach the far end of the grotto, the passage widens into a small chamber, where the air feels strangely still. A shallow basin carved into the floor holds brackish water, and at its edge you notice tiny shells arranged in a delicate spiral, a makeshift offering. Perhaps left by someone who believed it would appease the sea dragons and keep storms at bay. You kneel and peer in, half expecting the water to ripple of its own accord, but it remains placid, mirroring your reflection back at you. In this sheltered hush, you recall that in mainstream medieval manuscripts, dragons symbolized both chaos and protection, always bound to the landscape that birthed them. You close your eyes, listening to the distant roar of waves and your own breathing, imagining a dive beneath, where scales gleam like mother of pearl and fins slice through in human grace. A faint beam of light catches on something metallic at the basin's bottom, a rusted ring, perhaps part of a rosary or a local fisher's talisman. Now forgotten, you pocket the ring for later examination, careful not to disturb the spiral of shells. Rising, you brush grit from your knees and turn back toward the tunnel's entrance. As you step into the fading light, the mist seems to envelope you once more, both home and frontier in this timeless coastal expanse. The faint clang of the bell drifts down, and you feel ready to continue, deeper into Celtic sea dragon lore, heart beating in sync with the rhythmic pulse of the tide. You follow the coastline northward now, your boots damp from sea spray, each step accompanied by the gentle squish of moss and grit beneath your soles. The air is colder here, the kind of cold that nips politely rather than bites. Far off, where the water meets the sky in a blur of gray and pewter, something stirs, maybe a wave, maybe a trick of the light. You squint, amused at how easily your mind now turns every shadow into a dragon's fin. But isn't that the point? You find yourself wondering how the earliest tales of these sea dragons began. It's one thing for a storyteller to invent creatures in the warmth of a fire-lit hall, flagon in hand. It's another to be adrift in mist so thick it swallows the boat behind you. With only a hunk of oat bread for company and the distant echo of something splashing where no boat should be. That's when stories become survival tools, compasses made of imagination. Historical accounts tell us that the Celts were seasoned mariners, traveling along the western coasts of Europe in the early Iron Age and beyond. They exchanged goods, language, and legends up and down the Atlantic archipelago. While they didn't leave behind sea charts in the modern sense, their oral traditions held vast maps of memory. In these, sea dragons weren't monsters, they were the tides themselves, personified to warn, to bless, or to explain. You crest a grassy hill, and below, nestled between two cliffs, is a small harbor. There's no one here now, save for a few ropes swaying from weather-beaten moorings. But you can easily picture it bustling 1,000 years ago, boats returning with their catch, children shrieking as they dashed between barrels, and elders pointing out to sea, muttering of shapes best not followed. Elders pointing out to sea, muttering of shapes best not followed. The earliest whispers of Celtic sea dragons likely began in places just like this. Picture a fisherman returning from an unusually long journey, eyes wider than normal, hands trembling not from cold but from wonder. He doesn't speak of storms or bad luck. He speaks of a creature rising from the water's depths, its body sleek and scaled, its eyes luminescent like twin moons. And everyone leans in, not to laugh, but to listen. Dragons in Celtic lore were often landbound, guardians of wells, sacred trees, or underground treasures. But along the coasts, where the land gave way to mystery, the dragon slipped into the sea. Here, it shed its wings, trading them for fins and tails, growing long enough to wrap around entire islands in some versions. A fringe version of the tale from northern Wales even claimed one dragon would sing lullabies to fishermen lost at sea, its voice disguised as wind through reeds. Of course, every region added its own flair. In Brittany, fishermen claimed the sea dragon could take human form, often appearing as a beautiful stranger asking to borrow a boat, always a bad idea. Meanwhile, on the Isle of Man, the sea serpent was said to be part eel, part goat, and entirely unhelpful in a crisis. You imagine being in a boat with that creature, trying to explain taxes or navigation, it would probably just blink at you and burp seawater. As you walk the harbor's edge, you spot a sun-bleached piece of driftwood shaped uncannily like a curled dragon's tail. You stoop to examine it, brushing away a trail of sand and finding, of all things, charcoal markings. They're crude, perhaps a child's drawing, but they sketch a long-necked creature looping around a boat. It's a small thing, but you feel the centuries compress around it, like a whispered echo of belief. Just behind the jetty, a stone circle juts from the grass, lopsided but clearly deliberate. These mini-cairns were often used as offering sites, not grand enough for public ritual but personal enough for families. A shell, a feather, a silver coin, all tokens tossed toward the sea in exchange for calm waters. One myth said that if you didn't leave a gift for the dragon before a voyage, you'd return to find your house turned backward. Not destroyed. Just backward. Which somehow feels worse. Another historical detail anchors you. Celtic maritime culture, especially along the Irish Sea, thrived on a kind of pragmatic superstition. Aboard their vessels, sailors would murmur blessings before setting off, many of which invoked watery spirits or dragon-like guardians. One such chant translated loosely as, "Breathe beneath me, scaled one, and hold me above the reef." It's not hard to imagine the comfort those words brought while facing the infinite blue. You continue past the harbor, up a grassy rise, where the wind suddenly shifts. The scent changes, less brine, more peat, and you realize you're approaching a long-abandoned watchpost. Its walls are mossy, but still intact, the entrance half buried in heather. You duck inside, greeted by silence and a handful of rusted tools left on a wooden bench. On the far wall, faint carvings, two intertwining serpents, suggest the watchers here also believed they weren't alone out at sea. You sit on the cold stone, letting your thoughts drift. It's here that a quirky theory from a modern folklorist surfaces in your mind, that the sea dragon stories were metaphors for emotional tides, grief, love, loneliness, that moved unpredictably but were part of the natural order. The Celts, they claimed, knew better than to name these things plainly, so they gave them fins and let them swim. A stone rolls down the hill outside, probably loosened by wind. You glance up, heart skipping slightly, then laugh at yourself. Dragons don't knock politely. But it's okay to pretend. You lean back, listening to the creaks of the watchpost and the sea murmuring below. By the time you stand again, the sun is low on the horizon, washing everything in that rich amber light that makes even puddles look like portals. Your steps are slower now. The stories feel heavier, or maybe it's just the air thick with memory. The harbor behind you fades into shadow, and ahead lies the open path toward the next piece of dragon lore, winding along the cliffs like the tale of something vast and unseen. You meander along a narrow footpath that clings stubbornly to the cliffside, one sheep track wide and treacherously slick in spots. Below, the sea breathes in and out with the cadence of an old sleeper, deep, rhythmic, and unknowably ancient. A pair of gulls scream overhead, then vanish into the mist, which now hugs the coastline like a woolen shawl pulled up against the dusk. As your boots crunch over scattered shale, you catch sight of a stone marker ahead. It's squat and lichen-covered, its inscription eroded nearly to oblivion. But the outline is still visible, a coiled serpent, crowned, its tongue unfurling like a ribbon. You smile. It's another of those familiar motifs, the crowned sea serpent of Dun Calad. The so-called watcher of the western tides. You pause to consider the tale. As the story goes, Dun Calad was once a promontory fort, long since collapsed into the sea. But before its fall, it was said to be guarded by a sea dragon so massive it could encircle the whole cliff, tail tucked neatly under chin. It didn't breathe fire. It didn't devour villages. It simply watched. And should any threat approach, pirates, rival clans, or overly ambitious Romans, the dragon would rise in silence, turn its great glassy eyes on the intruder, and stare until they turned around. One scholar suggested the myth was a metaphor for isolationist pride. Another said it was likely just an elaborate way of explaining fog. Mainstream archaeological digs in these western promontories have found signs of ancient hill forts dating back to the Bronze Age. Many were strategically placed to offer clear sightlines across the sea, which makes sense for trade, and even more sense if you needed time to spot a dragon curling toward your settlement. You step closer to the edge, where the remains of a low wall peek through the gorse. Moss-covered stones tumble down toward the sea, a once proud foundation now surrendered to time. You run a hand over the rough surface, imagining what it would have felt like to be a young watchman here, just you, your breath fogging the night air, and a long silence between the crash of waves. And maybe, just maybe, the faint ripple of something massive moving far below. Celtic sea dragons weren't always beasts. In some traditions, they were protectors. In others, omens. And in a few charmingly strange cases, they were surprisingly bureaucratic. A lesser-known tale from Skye speaks of a sea dragon who handled disputes between islanders, emerging once a year to hear grievances and dispense justice with a thunderous tail thwack of approval or dismay. You can't help but wonder what the paperwork looked like. The mist curls tighter now, clinging to your clothing, wrapping around your ankles. You pass a low stone bench, likely a more recent addition by an optimistic rambler who thought this a good picnic spot. You sit, brushing away a film of dew, and stare out over the waves. Out here, there's a sense that time folds in on itself. You're watching the sea the same way someone did 100 years ago, 1,000, perhaps more. You suspect they too imagined what lived beneath, a school of dolphins arcs in the distance, graceful, effortless. You smile, picturing a time when such shapes were taken as proof of sea spirits or young dragons at play. Some fringe folklorists argue that early dragon myths were inspired by real marine creatures, basking sharks mistaken for serpents, the undulating backs of whales, even floating logs with just enough curve to suggest a watching eye. You recall a curious anecdote from a 19th-century antiquarian who visited these coasts and reported being offered dragon broth by a local widow. It turned out to be a kelpan herring stew, allegedly cooked on dragon-shaped stones passed down for generations. He described it as alarmingly salty but spirited, which feels like an apt review of many Celtic dishes. Below the cliffs, the tide begins to withdraw, revealing dark, slippery rock streaked with seaweed and littered with tidal pools. From up here, the pools glitter like scattered coins. It's easy to see why the ancients believed sea dragons hoarded treasure, not in the fire-breathing, smog-sitting on a pile of gold way, but in the quieter accumulation of pearls, coral, and shimmering fish scales. In one coastal folktale from Donegal, a dragon was said to nest beneath the rocks, laying eggs no larger than pebbles. Should a fisherman step on one, he'd forget his own name until the tide came back in. You picture the poor man wandering the beach, calling himself Seagull McTurnip and wondering why his boots didn't match. A gust of wind tugs at your coat, and you rise from the bench, following the path upward as it narrows again. The sky is a pale lavender now, the last vestiges of daylight stretched thin. Ahead lies a ruined watchtower, just a stubby outline against the sky, but it's enough to draw you on. A raven takes off from the crumbling stone, wings slicing the air in complete silence. You nod in appreciation. That bird clearly understands atmosphere, you reach the tower just as the last light fades. There's no roof, and half the wall has fallen into the sea, but what remains is enough. You duck inside and lean against the surviving corner, watching the sky shift into stars. One by one, they blink into being, mirrored faintly by the ocean below. The sea is almost unnervingly calm, too still, too glassy. You remember now the myth of Enoch, the dragon of mirrored waters, who only surfaced when the ocean was utterly still. She was said to reflect the stars on her scales and carry messages from the gods in the way she swam. Not a creature to fear, but one to watch. Those who saw her and listened often returned with answers they hadn't known they were looking for. You close your eyes and listen. Just wind, waves, and the rustle of grasses on the cliff above. But if you concentrate, really concentrate, you swear you hear something more. The faintest splash. The slow shift of a massive form turning in the deep. Or maybe it's just your heartbeat, slowed by wonder. Either way, the sea dragon stories endure. Etched not just in stone, but in this lingering hush, in the waves that pull and push as they always have. You wrap your coat tighter, smile to yourself, and step back onto the path. There's more ahead, more dragons, more songs, more flickers of fin and scale and whispered wind. The path now weaves inland, leaving behind the dramatic sea cliffs and winding into a tangle of low-lying hills flecked with wild thyme and weather-worn sheep. A soft drizzle has begun to fall, the kind of misty rain that doesn't quite soak you but insists on clinging, drop by drop, like a sleepy toddler refusing to be set down. You tip your head back and let it land on your face, cool, clean, and oddly invigorating. As you round a bend, you see it, a circular lake cradled in a hollow of hills, perfectly still, as if someone has laid down a mirror to catch the sky. Locals call it the Dragon's Eye. You walk closer, the ground springy underfoot, and take in the silence. No bird song. No wind. Just the quiet hum of nature holding its breath. This lake, according to legend, was home to a water dragon named Morna. Unlike the grand sea serpents of the open ocean, Morna was subtle, slippery as rumor, gentle as mist. She never left her lake, but it was said she could see everywhere the clouds touched. People would come here not to hunt her, but to ask questions. They'd whisper their problems to the water, and if Morna approved, she'd send a ripple, just one, that curved clockwise. If she disapproved, well, the ripple would curl the other way, and you'd best go home and rethink your choices. The Dragon's Eye, still as it is, becomes a sort of lens through which you begin to understand a different facet of Celtic dragon lore, dragons as oracles. Not merely threats or protectors, but quiet judges of human folly. You imagine someone trudging here from miles away just to ask whether they should marry a flax weaver or a goose herder, and then waiting an entire afternoon for a single little wave. And when it finally comes? A clockwise swirl, barely more than a breath on the surface. Decision made. Wedding planned. There's something curiously restful about that, isn't there? Letting the natural world, and its imagined creatures, do the heavy lifting of life's choices. You sit by the lake for a while, letting your eyes drift across its glossy surface, half hoping Morna will grant you a ripple. Not because you have a great decision to make, but because it feels polite to ask. Mainstream historians acknowledge that lakes held particular spiritual weight in Celtic traditions. Offerings have been found in lake beds across Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, swords, coins, jewelry, all seemingly placed with great reverence. Some believe these were gifts to water spirits. Others argue they were simply ritual acts without personal deities attached. But then again, historians still argue whether the dragons were metaphors, misunderstood wildlife, or outright inventions born of foggy isolation and fermented berries. Back at the lake's edge, you lean closer and peer into the water. For a moment, you think you see movement beneath the surface. A long, pale shape gliding slowly, too smooth to be a fish, too gentle to be wind. You blink. It's gone. Or maybe it was never there. That's the charm of places like this, they play with the edges of your certainty, and here's where the quirky twist arrives. In one account recorded in the 18th century, though its accuracy is hotly debated, a local elder claimed Morna the lake dragon once fell in love with a fiddler. The fiddler, unaware, played every day by the water, his music tumbling out across the surface like sunlight. One evening, the dragon rose in her shimmering form and asked him to marry her. He politely declined, citing a deep fear of commitment and also a general avoidance of creatures with more than 2 eyelids. Morna, heartbroken but composed, reportedly gifted him an enchanted bowstring made of silver kelp. From that day on, his music could summon rain. This worked both for and against him, especially when performing at outdoor weddings. You rise and follow a narrow path that skirts the lake, winding through a stretch of stunted trees bent low by wind and time. Their bark is etched with old initials and occasional spirals, some of which look suspiciously like coiled dragons. One particular tree, an ash near the northern tip, bears a carving of a long-snout creature with what appears to be spectacles? Perhaps an artistic flourish. Or perhaps someone once imagined Morna enjoying poetry and seeing clearly. Beyond the trees lies a low stone cottage, now roofless, its interior claimed by brambles. This is known locally as the Fiddler Rest, though no records confirm whether the musician ever lived here. You step inside, running your fingers along the stone windowsill, and find a small cluster of bluebells growing in a perfect circle. A natural occurrence, or another quiet offering, Celtic mythology often danced gracefully between the mundane and the magical. You could live a perfectly normal life, tending sheep, making bread, arguing about fence lines, and still believe entirely that a dragon in a lake could tell you whether your cousin should marry into the wool trade. No contradiction needed. In fact, it was the balance that made the stories last. The dragons didn't scream for belief. They just existed at the edges, calmly waiting to be noticed. As you leave the Fiddler Rest and climb a hill overlooking the lake, the drizzle lets up. The sky lightens just enough to give the water a shimmer. You glance back one last time and see a single, perfect ripple curl across the surface of the dragon's eye. Clockwise, you raise your eyebrows. "Thanks, Morna," you whisper, feeling oddly reassured. From here, the path forks. One trail winds into deeper forest. The other curls back toward the coast. You take the second. Not because the forest holds nothing, but because something on the sea breeze beckons, like the far-off call of a conch shell or the whoosh of a tail slicing through brine. Morna has granted her peace. But out on the open water, other dragons stir, and so, you walk on, mist at your heels and see ahead, toward the next story curling just beneath the surface, ready to rise. The coast returns gradually, first as a scent, sharp with salt and kelp, then as a sound, distant waves gently punching the shore like a boxer in a daydream. You crest a hill and spot the outline of a cove below, its curve soft and welcoming, as if the land is trying to cradle something precious. A weathered signpost leans to one side, the paint long faded, but you make out the words, "Onfa's Hollow." You make your way down the slope, boots sliding on loose gravel, until your feet touch soft sand. The beach here is made of pebbles worn round and smooth, perfect for tossing into the water with satisfying plunks. You try one. It skips twice, then vanishes. Not bad, the legend of Onfa. The dragon of the hollow is a stranger one. She wasn't serpentine or sleek. In fact, she was often described in stories as shaped like a seal who gave up on Pilates. She was said to be mild-mannered, reclusive, and, by all accounts, deeply sentimental. This cove was her sanctuary, a place she'd come not to hunt or haunt, but to listen, according to local tales, Onfa adored song. Any kind. Fishermen's shanties, lullabies, even badly whistled tunes. It didn't matter. If music drifted over the waves into her hollow, she'd rise from the surf just far enough to listen, head barely breaching the water, ears twitching like a cat's. In the most beloved version of the myth, Anfa cried actual tears of joy when a passing sailor played the harp. Of course, historians still argue whether Anfa was simply a poetic reimagining of seal colonies, which once thrived along this part of the coast. One 19th-century folklorist insisted the dragon was a metaphor for loneliness, noting the melancholic bent to many of the Anfa tales. Another suggested the stories were thinly veiled warnings against loud drunken singing near the water, especially if you couldn't carry a tune. But not all versions were somber. In one fringe variant told in the Orkney Isles, Anfa was said to collect the echoes of songs and stash them inside sea caves. If you ventured into the right cave and stood very still, you'd hear a patchwork concert of voices past, tuneless sailors, lovesick villagers, and even a goat herder who once tried to invent jazz. The caves around Anfa's hollow are real enough, dark, damp, and echo-rich. You duck into one now, careful on the slippery stones, and hear, well, mostly dripping water. But there's a kind of hush that suggests a performance just ended. As you sit in the cave's mouth, waves rolling in and out like lazy breath, you let your mind drift. Perhaps Anfa's real power wasn't her shape or size, but the calm she inspired. The idea of a creature so moved by music she'd rise from the depths just to listen. No need to conquer. No desire to hoard. Just a love of melody, however imperfect. You remember a curious find noted in an early excavation nearby, a carved stone pendant shaped like a harp, buried with what appeared to be an oar. The archaeologists dubbed it the boatman's song. No definitive link to dragons, but the location suggests someone believed this cove mattered. Out on the horizon, a small boat cuts across the water, leaving a thin wake. You watch it for a while, imagining it's the same path sailors took centuries ago. Drifting past this hollow, humming half-forgotten songs into the wind. Somewhere in those notes, maybe, Anfa still listens. Back on the beach, you wander toward a rock shelf covered in shallow pools. Starfish cling lazily to the undersides. Tiny crabs scuttle like they've remembered appointments. In one clear pool, you spot a glint of blue, a bit of sea glass, rounded and smoothed by time. You pocket it, half-jokingly calling it a dragon's tear. Who's to say it isn't? The air smells faintly of rosemary now, likely from the scrub clinging to the cliffs above. A lazy gull glides overhead, wings held still like a paper glider on a breeze. You lie down on the pebbles, arms spread wide, and let the sky tilt slowly around you. There's something healing about this place. It's not grand or fearsome. No towering ruins, no epic monuments. Just a small cove where people believed in a dragon who cried at lullabies. A creature of quiet, of deep feeling, of impossible ears. The kind of story that doesn't demand belief, only a bit of gentleness, and still, there are questions. Did the tale of Anfa spring from shared sightings of a rare sea creature? Was she born of loneliness? Shaped into myth by the isolated communities who watched the sea more often than they spoke to one another? Or was she a pure invention, an emotional placeholder, a soft beast for softer nights? Historians still argue whether Anfa's origin lies in Norse seal myths absorbed into Celtic lore, or if she was always here, drifting beneath the surf of imagination. Some even claim Anfa was a waterbound echo of the banshee, less shriek, more hum. A comfort spirit, not a harbinger. A hush where there might have been fear. You sit up and glance back at the water. The tide has risen slightly. One of the larger rocks now wears a cap of foam. For the briefest moment, it looks like a head. Not monstrous. Not even really dragon-like. Just curious. Listening, you give a little wave. There's no answer, but there doesn't need to be. As you leave the cove, you follow a footpath lined with flat stones, each etched with spirals and wave patterns. Whether they're ancient markings or modern embellishments, it's hard to say. But they guide you gently away from Onfa's Hollow and toward a stretch of coastline where the cliffs rise again, and other, older dragons are said to wait. The footpath climbs gently now, flanked by tufts of golden gorse and low brambles that seem to catch every thread of your clothing, like over-friendly greeters at a countryside wedding. The sea is to your left, widening out into a glittering expanse. You pause at a jagged outcrop and look down. The waves crash below in slow motion, as though even the ocean is half asleep. This stretch of coast is known as the lair of Yulbheist Doit, or the Scorched Beast. The name alone feels a bit dramatic for a sleepy myth, but don't worry, this dragon was more misunderstood than monstrous. Yulbheist was said to be a coastal guardian, with a minor fire problem, according to local legends. Yulbheist had a habit of singeing things accidentally. Not on purpose, never on purpose. Just a little flame here and there, a scorched bush, a melted fishing net, once even a slightly toasted cow. The poor creature apparently couldn't sneeze without a few sparks, which made living near curious humans tricky. Eventually, the villagers carved out a peace offering, a wide, flat stone platform near the cliff's edge. They'd leave roasted fish there every solstice, both as tribute and, let's be honest, to prevent further cow flambe incidents. The Scorched Beast's name may be dramatic, but the vibe around this place is almost silly in its gentleness. You spot one of those offering stones now, cracked but still sturdy, ringed with small seashells arranged like scales. A few bright pebbles sit at its center. Someone's kept the tradition alive, it seems. Or maybe it was a child playing dragon games with their parent, giggling about toasty fish. Mainstream history doesn't mention Yulbheist, of course. But they do note that fire rituals were common in ancient Celtic cultures, particularly around Beltane and Lugnasad festivals. These seasonal events often involved bonfires, symbolic burning, and offerings. Scholars suggest the dragon might have emerged as a cozy personification of these traditions, a creature of warmth and protection, not destruction. Or, if you're feeling playful, maybe just a cautionary tale for children learning to cook over open flame. Watch out, or you'll end up like Aunt Murin's stew, courtesy of Yulbheist. There's one especially peculiar tale that stands out. It's about a traveling blacksmith who came through the area with a cart full of bells, yes. Bells. He planned to sell them to a monastery inland, but on his way, he stopped near Yulbheist's territory and camped for the night. The legend claims the dragon approached him, sniffed the bells, and promptly sneezed a plume of fire that melted half his inventory. Instead of fleeing or fighting, the blacksmith simply laughed. "Guess we're doing chimes now," he said, and from then on he made wind chimes from the warped metal, tuning them to sing softly in the coastal breeze. The story ends with Yulbheist visiting him each summer, curling quietly beside the smithy while the chimes played, a warm companion, like a giant scaly cat with a sinus condition. You reach a point in the path where the wind picks up. The air smells faintly smoky, not from anything burning, but more like the memory of smoke. A sun-warmed rock. A beach bonfire long since gone out. You imagine Yulbheist lounging nearby, tail curled neatly, eyes half-lidded, trying very hard not to set anything ablaze. Maybe wearing mittens. Maybe not. One weathered local saying claims that if your campfire flares too high too fast, Yulbheist is passing nearby and just couldn't help it. Another says that if your tea kettle whistles on an empty stove, you've got a fire dragon spirit visiting. Best offer them a biscuit and a compliment on their restraint. You sit down on the grass near the offering stone and watch the clouds drift slowly inland. One of them looks suspiciously like a snoozing lizard. Another like a kettle, steaming gently. You wonder if anyone ever thought of Yulbheist as a kind of hearth spirit, accidental though the hearth may be. Not quite a house guest, but a warm presence lurking just outside the edge of human comfort. Something to acknowledge, appease, and maybe secretly adore. You pick up a smooth pebble, blackened on one side, either from fire or from generations of weather, and place it beside the others. It seems only fair. Maybe Yulbheist still checks in sometimes, snuffling the wind for hints of baked fish and friendly memories. Maybe not. Either way, it's comforting to pretend, before you go, you take a final glance at the sea. It's calming here, less dramatic than the dragon's name suggests. Even the waves sound gentler, as if they've been told to whisper. And in that hush, you think about all the ways fire can soothe rather than scar. A kettle singing. A hearth flickering. A spark rising and curling like a dragon's sigh. As you continue on your path, the cliffs stretch ahead, growing a little steeper now. The land curves toward a cluster of sea stacks rising like jagged teeth from the water, prime dragon territory, if you believe the stories. And really, by now, how could you not? You give the scorched stone one last look. A breeze rustles the grass. No flames. Just warmth in the air, and the softest whiff of sea smoke. The cliffside path narrows slightly now, winding along the edge of a grassy ridge with nothing but wild sea to your left and stubborn bramble to your right. You follow the trail carefully, boots brushing heather and the occasional patch of stubborn moss. Below, waves crash and retreat like the slow breathing of some ancient creature just beneath the surface. You begin to suspect you're walking along a dragon's spine, though not the kind you've met before. This stretch is home to a tale not of fire or flight, but of stone. The legend speaks of Na Craobarian, the branching ones, dragons made not of scale and sinew but of living rock and root. They weren't born, exactly. They grew. From cliff to cave, from stone to story, these dragons weren't feared or even particularly noticed. Their movements were glacial. They shifted so slowly that it was said moss sprouted on their backs before they finished a turn. Entire families of puffins nested in their eyes without ever suspecting a thing. Even now, some locals claim the sea stacks that loom ahead were once Na Craobarian themselves, paused mid-emergence and then, simply forgot what they were doing. You reach the edge of the cliffs and see them, jagged pillars rising from the surf, worn by wind and sea into craggy silhouettes. One looks suspiciously like a hunched figure. Another, more confidently, resembles a dragon's tail curling around an invisible hoard of sunken treasure. Seagulls perch atop the tallest like they own the place. Mainstream geologists, of course, say these formations are just sea stacks, natural erosion, wave action, all very scientific. But if you squint, especially with the sun dipping low and the shadows lengthening, it's hard not to imagine the shapes stirring slightly. Just a blink. Just a breath. The oddest part of the Na Craobarian myths is their quiet dignity. They weren't hunters, hoarders, or protectors. They were observers. Legends claim they remembered every tide, every whisper of wind through grass, every footstep that dared approach their territory. Not for vengeance or curiosity, but simply because they could. Because remembering was what they did. One folk tale describes a wandering druid who spent a decade sitting beside a silent cliff dragon, whispering stories into the stone. He'd speak each day, tales of his travels, of love lost, of bread recipes and weather complaints. At the end of 10 years, the story goes, the dragon turned ever so slightly toward him and blinked once. The druid was never seen again. Historians assume he simply walked off into the fog. Locals say he was invited to stay, nestled forever inside the stone, his stories echoing softly beneath the surface. Of course, there's also the more practical theory, the druid just really liked rocks. Which is fair. You clamber down a rough slope, careful on the lichen-slick stones, and find a little plateau that overlooks the largest of the sea stacks. From here, you can hear the wind rush through gaps in the rock, creating a low, hollow howl that could definitely pass for a dragon snoring. You sit for a while, staring at the stone giants, and let your thoughts drift. There's something oddly comforting about a creature that simply waits. No battles. No quests. Just patient presence. Like a pet boulder with secrets, a lesser-known version of the legend claims that if you press your ear to the ground near a stack and hum a tune from childhood, the stone will hum back. Gently. You decide against trying it, partly because you're not sure the ground is all that's sanitary, and partly because your childhood songs were mostly about sheep who wore trousers. But you're tempted. The sun begins to dip lower now, bleeding orange across the water. A soft chill drifts in from the sea, brushing your skin like a whispered reminder that even dragons made of stone can grow cold. Still, Nacreobarian are never truly gone. The story insists they're still listening. Every shift in the earth, every pebble kicked down a slope, every sigh of a weary traveler, catalogued, remembered, and stored in the silent ledger of living rock, you find yourself wondering what the cliffs might remember of you. Your slow steps. Your snack break involving suspiciously stale oatcakes. The tune you hummed without realizing, some half-remembered melody your grandmother used to sing while stirring porridge. Before you go, you notice a small pile of balanced stones nearby, a cairn. Someone's been here before, maybe many someones. You add a stone to the top, careful not to knock the rest. It wobbles, steadies, holds. A small offering to a creature that asks for nothing but time, and so, you turn away from the sea stacks and continue inland, the cliffs gradually giving way to grassy headland. Somewhere far behind you, a stone dragon watches your retreat, unmoving but perhaps not unseeing. You leave the cliff's edge behind, and the path grows wider, cozier somehow, flanked now by wild rosemary and patches of shamrock so green they look almost artificial, like the land is showing off. The air is softer here. The wind hushes to a whisper, and the scent of salt gives way to loamy earth and something faintly herbal, like someone's brewing a midnight tea just out of sight. You begin to notice carved stones nestled into the hillside. Not grave markers or boundary posts, but small upright slabs with swirling patterns and notched corners. The kind of thing that looks like it should mean something, but doesn't quite explain itself. You pass one shaped like a spiral, another like a fish with too many eyes, and a third with, what is that, a bird wearing what looks like a very sensible pair of shoes. This area is known as the Vale of Forgotten Companions. It's not marked on most maps, but the few who still remember it say it was once a resting ground for the sidekicks of Celtic sea beasts. Yes, you heard that right. Not the dragons themselves, but their faithful, overlooked little helpers. Every legendary creature, it seems, needed a buddy. Not for glory, more for logistical support. Someone to untangle kelp from wings, to make sure no children wandered into the sacred hoard pile, or to fetch the dragon's favorite moss when it had a cold. Picture a seabird with a clipboard. A stoat in reading glasses. A seal who knows how to brew just the right kind of seaweed broth for indigestion. One of the best-known sidekick legends is about Banag the otter, companion to a long-vanished dragon named Murianak. Banag didn't breathe fire or fly, but he could organize a seabed like nobody's business. The story goes that Banag once alphabetized Murianaka's hoard, by mineral type, not color, and earned himself a scale of honor, worn forever in a tiny belt he fashioned from eel leather. You step over a mossy stone shaped like a fishbone. Is it a marker? A memory? Or just erosion being theatrical? Hard to say. You start to imagine each stone as a placeholder for a creature lost to time. The unpaid interns of legend. The support staff who never made the epics, and, historically, Celtic mythology does suggest a fondness for the lesser beasts. Not lesser in spirit, mind you, just not front and center. Birds who served as messengers, hares seen as omens, seals who shape-shifted into humans, or vice versa, depending on the mood. Folklore from the Western Isles sometimes mentions sea dragons that would only come ashore if they're familiar. A particular gull or fox led the way. Some say these familiars chose the dragons, not the other way around. you sit down beside one of the stones, shaped like a tiny wave curling back on itself. There's a smoothness to it that suggests years of weather and a great deal of quiet. You half expect a ghostly ferret to appear and scold you for not bringing any dried fish snacks. But instead, the breeze just tousles your hair and moves on. One of the more fringe stories tells of Grimbold the Puffin, who wore a tiny sea glass monocle and served as navigator for a blind water dragon during spring migrations. Historians still argue whether this tale began as a satirical poem or as a bedtime story told to convince children that puffins were excellent judges of direction. Either way, it paints a charming image: a puffin perched on a dragon's snout, muttering left at the kelp bed, then follow the current until you sneeze twice. The veil begins to slope downward now, and with it, a change in sound. You hear the faint trickle of a stream, one that legends say was dug by badgers in service to a particularly thirsty CWIRM. Whether or not that's true, the water is cold and clear, and when you kneel to taste it, it feels like sipping from a forgotten dream. You follow the stream a little farther, and on its banks, you spot what looks like a half-buried carved bowl. Moss has claimed its rim, but you can just make out a dragon's tail curling into a spiral at its base. Perhaps it was a water dish. Perhaps an offering bowl. Perhaps an ancient sidekick's best attempt at pottery before the dragon told them gently, "Let's just order something next time." This entire section of the coast feels like it was designed for companions, not champions. A place where the overlooked went to rest, where the background became the foreground, and where even a rabbit who once fetched firewood for a sea serpent might get a small, mossy monument. You can't help but feel a quiet fondness for these tales. They feel oddly familiar, comforting. Not every story needs a roar and wings. Sometimes all you need is a well-organized den and someone who knows where the extra kelp is stored. The sun is low now, slipping toward the horizon with a golden shrug. Shadows lengthen over the veil, and the carved stones catch the light just so, like they're smiling. You rise, stretch, and continue on your path, already imagining what other unsung creatures you might meet ahead. The path now threads its way through tall ferns, their fronds brushing your sleeves like sleepy guardians waving you along. The air is warm here, blanketed by the insulating hush of foliage and the faint scent of damp earth. You step carefully, as if not to wake the moss. Eventually, the ferns part, revealing a wide, round hollow, a kind of natural amphitheater, rimmed with low stones and feathered with grass. A circle not made for battle, or sacrifice, or feasting. No. This was a gathering place for stories. The kind dragons and mortals told not to impress, but simply to pass the time. This is the Whispering Hollow, where the sea dragons of old, at least according to local lore, came not to show off or hoard, but to gossip. Yes, even dragons need to vent occasionally. And this, so the stories go, was the place for it. You step into the center, and the acoustics immediately change. Every footfall seems to echo a little longer than it should. A sniffle would probably carry to the ferns. It's said that one particular dragon, Turkan the mildly chatty, once spilled all the tea here, literal and figurative, about a feud between two rival kelp-dwelling leviathans over who got to court the last singing seal of Innis Tuath. Spoiler: the seal chose neither and swam off with a handsome walrus named Jeff. As unlikely as it seems, the tradition of dragons sharing tales, of weather patterns, ocean currents, fish recipes gone wrong, wasn't so much dramatic as it was relatable. One ancient myth says these gatherings were mostly structured around grumble time, where dragons could complain about barnacles, stubborn fog, or the existential weight of being mistaken for a rock formation for 3 straight centuries. Mainstream Celtic texts do reference communal storytelling as sacred, though usually in human contexts, like bardic circles or winter hearth gatherings. But some fringe scholars have speculated that these traditions mirrored older, mythical patterns, ones possibly inspired by the imagined habits of the land and sea themselves. You settle on one of the low stones, feeling the hollow curve around you like a soft bowl. There's something soothing in imagining these immense creatures, sea dragons with fins like kelp fronds and teeth like carved coral, sharing tales in the fading light. Not roaring or flaming. Just talking. Quietly. Kindly. Perhaps one would begin a story with "You'll never guess what the Selkie said to me last solstice." While another carved little patterns in the sand with a tail tip, nodding sagely. One popular tale recounts a game they played here called Scale or Tale, where each dragon had to present either a shiny new scale or a story they hadn't told before. Winners were given bragging rights and the last eel dumpling, which, honestly, sounds like a fair prize. Another folktale describes a ritual performed only during blue moon tides, when the sea glowed with phosphorescent algae. The dragons would each float a small item, scale, shell, or stone, into the sea, whisper a memory to it, and watch it drift away. The idea was to let go of one old tale, to make room for a new one. That's actually kind of sweet, isn't it? There's an old carving nearby, half sunk into the grass, depicting a trio of long, coiled dragons gathered in a circle, tails touching, heads turned inward. The style is unmistakably ancient, spiral motifs and sinuous lines, but the mood it captures is unmistakably domestic. Cozy. Not terrifying beasts, but friends with tea and time to spare. One particularly odd local legend insists that a small number of bards once snuck into the hollow, hoping to learn the dragon stories firsthand. They disguised themselves as seals, slipped in during a thick fog, and waited quietly. But instead of grand secrets or mystical revelations, they heard complaints about itchy scales, a dodgy clam vendor, and the surprising downside of immortality, too many birthdays, apparently. Still, the bards were delighted. They returned home and penned what became some of the least dramatic, but most beloved, sea ballads in the region. You get the sense that if you whispered a story here, even now, even as a human with no tail or scales or particularly interesting complaints, it might be received. Not judged. Just noted. Added to the eternal soup pot of tales that makes this place quietly magical, the ground beneath you feels unusually warm. Probably geothermal something or other. Or maybe, just maybe, an ancient dragon is still snoozing somewhere deep below, eavesdropping gently in its dreams. You think of the stories you'd offer up, if you could. Maybe that time you tripped over your own feet trying to impress someone at a farmer's market. Or the weird dream you had about a dolphin who ran a library. Nothing earth-shattering. Just a slice of you, because that's the point of this place, isn't it? Sharing the little things. The quiet, sleepy, oddly shaped tales that don't need heroes or villains, just listeners. A soft breeze stirs the grasses, and for a moment, it sounds like a sigh. Or a chuckle. You smile, rising from the circle, brushing off the seat of your trousers as if excusing yourself from a particularly cozy dinner party. As you walk on, the hollow fades behind you. But it lingers, in that way quiet places do. A reminder that even the grandest myths have room for the ordinary. That even sea dragons, for all their mystery, might just want someone to talk to. The terrain begins to shift again, rising slightly as the path curls toward the headland. You tread more slowly now, not from fatigue, but because something about the air has changed. It's cooler, yes, but also richer, like the sea mist has picked up a scent of ink, parchment, and fish bones. A strange mix, admittedly, but not entirely unpleasant. Before long, the ferns thin, revealing the entrance to a tucked-away cove. You step through an arch of stone worn smooth by centuries of salt spray and find yourself staring at a crumbling structure nestled into the cliffside, half cave, half ruin. The wind whips past, carrying the smell of seaweed and secrets. This is what remains of the Draconic Scriptorium, a place whispered about in the more eccentric corners of Celtic lore. Where, it's said, sea dragons once attempted to write things down, yes. Quills. Ink. Scrolls. The works, now, obviously, historians still argue whether this was ever more than an elaborate metaphor. After all, dragons, by conventional understanding, lack thumbs. Or at least the fine motor skills required to produce legible script. But fringe scholars, and a few surprisingly passionate folklorists from County Kerry, maintain that certain sea dragons were not only literate, but enthusiastic diarists. One story claims the dragon Coastlines of the Coiling Quill maintained a daily journal for 600 years, etched not onto parchment but into long strips of dried kelp. These kelp scrolls, according to lore, were woven into a living manuscript that unfurled with the tide, readable only at moonrise and only if you asked politely. As you duck into the ruin, your footsteps echo over the uneven floor, stone slabs arranged in something like a spiral pattern, drawing you inward. The walls are rough and dark, but etched with strange marks, swirls, waves, and what might be an alphabet, if you squint hard enough and tilt your head a little. One wall bears a carving of what could be a dragon delicately holding a writing tool in its teeth, with a caption, possibly sarcastic, underneath. You can't read it, but you get the sense it might say something like, "Yes, I wrote that. You're welcome." The notion of literate dragons may sound absurd, but consider this: in Celtic tradition, bards were sacred, lore was oral, and stories were survival. A dragon, living hundreds, if not thousands, of years, would be a walking, swimming, occasionally flying encyclopedia. It makes a kind of sleepy, poetic sense that they might try to preserve their own versions of events. And maybe even correct a few. One myth recounts how a sea dragon grew tired of being misquoted by human bards and stormed the local feasting hall during a solstice gathering, not to attack, but to fact-check. Supposedly, it dictated corrections to the story of the Second Battle of Mag Twyard, clarifying that the roaring beast described was, in fact, just coughing due to a spicy clam. The room you stand in now, if we can call it that, might have been a scriptoria of sorts. Maybe not for hands and ink, but for thought and memory. The walls have been smoothed in places, as if something large rubbed against them regularly, perhaps while thinking. Or perhaps trying to align a thought with a particular wall groove. You notice a cluster of stones arranged near the center, low, flat, oddly inviting. Not seats, necessarily. But not just random, either. You imagine a dragon curling around this spot, dictating aloud. Perhaps to a seal assistant who took notes in sand. Perhaps to no one at all. There's one particularly strange artifact nestled in the corner, a spiral-shaped basin, about the size of a bathtub, filled with rainwater and lined with shards of something once glassy. Folklore calls it the reflecting inkwell, said to have been used by dragons to write with memory. The idea was that the basin, when filled with the right mix of water, salt, and moonlight, would show the past. But only the small, forgotten moments, the time a dragon misplaced its favorite pebble, or that awkward exchange with a flirtatious selkie that didn't go as planned. It's easy to dismiss all of this as myth layered over myth. But then again, who's to say? Not everything needs proof to be felt. Sometimes belief itself is the ink that writes the story. A light rain begins to fall outside, tapping gently against the stone. You take a seat near the basin and imagine dipping a quill into its surface, watching words form in ripples. Today, I remembered the smell of a storm before it arrived. You smile. Somehow that seems like something a dragon would write. Not about hordes or conquests, but about weather and memory. And maybe the joy of discovering a new type of barnacle that made an excellent back-scratcher. You stay there for a while, listening to the sound of water and wind, half wishing a scaly librarian would slither in and offer you a mug of warm brine and a cozy footnote, but instead, only time moves. The rain slows. The mist thickens. And when you finally rise and step outside again, the world feels just a little more storied, like a chapter half written, waiting for your quiet steps to finish the sentence. Back on the path, you pause at a fork in the trail. One side bends inland toward wind-bent trees and grassy ridges. The other dips lower, toward a network of rocky pools glistening in the muted light. You, of course, take the tide path, the one lined with sea-pink flowers and slippery stones. You've come this far into myth, a few barnacles won't deter you now. At the base of the slope lies a landscape of shallow basins carved by millennia of water and whim. This is the dragon's larder, according to old local lore. A place where sea dragons were said to gather not for battle or brooding, but to cook. Yes, cook. You step between tide pools as if weaving through a kitchen mid-rush hour. There's something oddly domestic about the place. Some pools are circular and deep, perfect for boiling. Others are wide and flat, as if designed for drying or curing seaweed. You spot shells arranged in careful patterns, not unlike spice racks. And one boulder even has notches carved into it that suspiciously resemble a recipe tally: 1 dash of moon kelp, 2 twists of salt eel, and a whole lot of just wing it. The stories say this was where dragons practiced the art of oceanic gastronomy. Not because they had to, but because they enjoyed it. After all, living for centuries gives you time to experiment with things like fermented jellyfish or smoked puffin eggs. And when you're the size of a fishing boat, taste matters. One old myth claims that dragons believed the texture of a meal was more important than the flavor. Chew like a sea cow, savor like a monk, as the proverb goes. You crouch beside one of the deeper pools, its surface still. This might have been a simmering station, if the tales are to be believed. Heated by volcanic vents and stirred occasionally by curious seals. Supposedly, the dragon Briogan the Briny invented the first known seafood broth here. It was called crag stew and featured clams, squid ink, crushed driftwood for fiber, and the occasional bit of lost sailor boot, optional, depending on seasoning. Of course, none of this is confirmed by archaeologists. The mainstream view is that these pools are just geological oddities. But local oral traditions beg to differ, and they've been passed down with surprising consistency. Children in the nearby villages still dare each other to leave tiny offerings here: scallop shells, bits of dried seaweed, or funny scribbled recipes like mermaid mac cheese. One tale tells of a traveling monk who stumbled upon a dragon in the middle of braising barnacle tips with lemon kelp. The monk was so impressed by the technique, and the aromas, that he offered to bless the stew. The dragon, confused but polite, accepted, then asked the monk if he'd like a taste. They shared a meal, and the monk returned home preaching the virtues of dragon cuisine, much to the confusion of his abbey. You look around and imagine it: dragons gently nudging rocks aside to get the heat just right. Giant tails swaying lazily as they sampled soups with barnacle spoons. It's not terrifying at all. It's kind of lovely. Like a seaside potluck hosted by ancient sea beasts with surprisingly discerning palates. Somewhere across the pools, you hear the soft plunk of water, a fish, maybe, or a memory dropping in. You smile. This place, with all its odd echoes and sun-dappled stones, feels less like a ruin and more like an open cookbook, each tide pool a page, each rock a sticky note left behind. There's even a tale, possibly fabricated by particularly imaginative schoolchildren, of a dragon bake-off held here during a total lunar eclipse. 3 dragons competed. One served sea slug sliders. One attempted a smoked seafoam sorbet. And the third, a wild card named Fluraith the Forgetful, accidentally created caramelized kelp chips while trying to start a fire with wet driftwood. She won by sheer delicious accident. You notice, on the edge of a larger pool, a flat slate carved with spiral patterns. It might be just erosion. Or it might be the mythical menu stone described in older texts, a kind of stone chalkboard where dragons etched out meal ideas, mood-based dishes. Or simply drew little doodles of fish with goofy faces. It's oddly comforting to think of dragons as not only powerful and majestic but goofy. Creatures who might argue over how long to marinate mackerel. Mainstream Celtic lore often emphasizes dragons as omens or protectors, but here in the larder, their mythology seems quieter. Friendlier. Like they were not guardians of gold, but keepers of recipes, culinary dragons who prized flavor over fire, and why not? A sea dragon's life is long, but the moments that matter are probably the smallest ones: a well-timed bubble, a perfectly tender scallop, a dinner shared with a sea otter who forgot to bring dessert but told excellent jokes. You linger a little longer, watching sunlight ripple across the water, catching flashes of sea glass and snail shells. It's easy to imagine that somewhere below the surface, a dragon's pantry remains, sealed in time, filled with forgotten flavors and sleepy intentions, and just like that, your stomach growls, you chuckle to yourself, and the sound echoes lightly off the rocks. Time to move on, before you start fantasizing about deep-fried kraken bites. You rise from the dragon's larder, the salty breeze carrying a hint of brine and distant seaweed. The path now climbs gently, curving around the cliffs as you follow the coastline's natural rhythm. The wind hums a low, soothing tune, a melody shaped by years of waves and whispering myths. Ahead, you spot a narrow inlet where the water pools calm and deep, almost black under the shifting sky. This is said to be the haunt of the Celtic sister, a dragon of unusual temperament and even stranger habits. Unlike the grand, fire-breathing figures of legend, she is known for her quiet love of storytelling and her peculiar fondness for human trinkets. The story goes that the Celtic sister was a guardian of lost things, forgotten necklaces, sunken combs, and old coins swallowed by the sea. She collected these treasures not to hoard, but to weave tales around them, linking each object to a story or a dream. You crouch beside the inlet, feeling the cool spray on your face as you imagine the dragon's movements beneath the surface. Her scales shimmer with the hues of twilight, a patchwork of sapphire and silver. She drifts slowly, weaving the stolen artifacts into underwater tapestries that shimmer faintly in the moonlight. It's easy to picture the scene, this serene dragon curving through water like liquid poetry, gathering memories like pearls. Her stories aren't the grand epics of battle or conquest but quiet moments of whimsy and wonder. Tales of sailors who dreamed of dancing dolphins, or children who lost their way but found magic in the fog. According to local lore, the Celtic sister once rescued a poet stranded on a storm-tossed rock. Instead of flame or fury, she offered him a gift, a coral pen and ink made from the deep sea, tools to capture the fleeting beauty of dreams. The poet returned to shore, his verses filled with the soft echo of tides and dragon whispers. This softer side of Celtic dragon mythology reminds you that not all myths roar with fire, some breathe gently with the pulse of the ocean, inviting you to listen closely. It's a world where dragons are caretakers of stories, not just beasts of legend. As you watch the water ripple, you feel a calm settling over you, as if the dragon's quiet magic has wrapped itself around your thoughts. The boundary between myth and reality blurs, and for a moment, you're just another listener, drawn into the endless, serene story of the sea. The coastline curves again, the waves gently lapping against jagged rocks softened by time. You follow the worn path as it leads you toward a cluster of ancient standing stones, weathered and moss-covered. These stones are said to mark the resting place of the elder dragon's heart, a mystical gem rumored to pulse with the essence of the sea itself. As you approach, you notice the air is thick with salt and something faintly metallic, like the memory of a storm long past. Local legend claims that the elder dragon was the first of its kind to rise from the ocean depths, its heart glowing bright enough to guide sailors through the darkest nights. You crouch beside one of the stones, feeling its cool roughness under your fingertips. The carvings are worn but still visible, spirals and wave patterns that seem to shimmer in the soft light. Some say these marks are ancient runes used to contain the dragon's power, others believe they are simply reminders of the sea's eternal rhythm. Interestingly, scholars still argue whether the elder dragon was a literal creature or a symbolic representation of the ocean's might and mystery. Some suggest that the stories arose as a way to explain natural phenomena, like bioluminescent tides or sudden storms. Others hold to the belief in an actual dragon whose life spanned centuries, its presence woven into the land and sea nearby. You spot a cluster of smooth pebbles arranged in a rough circle, a miniature cairn built by travelers and believers. You add your own pebble, feeling a quiet connection to the generations who have walked this shore before you. There's a quirky local tale about a fisherman who once tried to steal a piece of the elder dragon's heart, hoping to sell it in the market. According to the story, he was thwarted not by fire or claw, but by an unexpected wave of deep, inexplicable sleep that overtook him right on the shore. He woke up hours later, the gem still untouched and the sea unusually calm. You imagine the scene. Perhaps the dragon's heart isn't just a source of power but also a guardian of peace, lulling intruders into dreams rather than anger. As the sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the stones, you take a deep breath, letting the serene energy of the place seep into your bones. The gentle crash of waves, the whisper of wind through the grass, the faint shimmer of ancient magic, all come together in a quiet lullaby. You stand and continue along the coast, the image of the glowing heart lingering softly in your mind, like a beacon guiding you gently onward. The rocky coast begins to level out as you near a sheltered bay where the water rests in gentle pools, reflecting the soft hues of a fading sky. Here, the myth speaks of a hidden grotto known as the Dragon's Lullaby Cavern, a place where sea dragons were said to gather to sing the ocean to sleep. The air hums faintly, as if the stones themselves remember the echo of their song. You step carefully inside, the cavern cool and dim, the scent of salt and ancient minerals wrapping around you like a soft blanket. The walls curve overhead, shaped by countless tides, and the water inside murmurs in quiet rhythms. Legend says the dragon's lullabies were not just music but magic, woven with the tides and currents. A gentle enchantment that calmed storms and soothed weary sailors. Some stories even claim that sailors who heard the lullaby while adrift woke up feeling as if they'd dreamed the ocean itself. You imagine the dragons, massive, serene creatures, half submerged in the water, eyes closed in quiet reverence as their voices blend with the sound of waves. It's a scene more peaceful than fearsome, a moment of fragile beauty caught between water and stone. A curious detail in the lore describes how the dragon's songs varied with the moon's phases. Full moon lullabies were rich and deep, while new moon melodies were soft whispers barely heard over the crashing surf. Folk singers from nearby villages claim to have passed down fragments of these songs. Their melodies still haunting the night air. Historians still argue whether the dragon's lullaby was a real practice or a poetic way to explain natural sounds like the singing of whales or the resonance of tides in caves. Regardless, the legend invites you to listen closely, to the sea, to the stones, and to the quiet music of the world. You pause in the cavern's heart, letting the silence settle over you. The gentle drip of water echoes softly, matching the rhythm of your breath. The myth's magic feels tangible here, like a whisper meant just for you. As you leave the cavern and step back into the fading light, you carry the lullaby with you, a melody that hums softly beneath the waves and beneath your thoughts. The path finally curves back toward familiar cliffs, the rhythmic pulse of the surf growing stronger as you near the starting point of your journey. You pause on a grassy rise where the wind stirs the heather, sending tiny lavender blossoms drifting like confetti. The sea stretches out before you, a vast expanse of silver gray under an evening sky. You inhale deeply, tasting salt and earth, feeling the gentle sway of nostalgia wash over you. Below, the inlet where you first imagined a dragon's eye glimmers in the dying light. The stones bearing spirals and wave patterns, the markers of so many tales, catch the sunset in warm relief. You recall the scripts of Coastlines, the tearful music of Anfa, and the hush of the lullaby cavern. Each story has pressed its memory into the landscape, and now you stand amidst the echoes of every whispered legend. Footsteps crunchy with gravel lead you down toward the beach. You pass the offering stone at Yulbheist, still ringed with polished pebbles, and the crest of Nacreobarian stacks, their silent watch unchanged. You feel the cool air brush your cheeks, as if the dragons themselves offer a final gentleness, a soft farewell. As you reach the sand, you notice a lone driftwood branch etched with faint carvings, perhaps the handiwork of a wandering storyteller. In the grooves you see tiny wave symbols and curling shapes reminiscent of the elder dragon's heart. You trace one swirl with your fingertip, imagining it as the heartbeat of the sea itself, still pulsing beneath the shore. You step into the shallow water, letting waves curl around your ankles. The tide is rising, carrying with it the modest offerings left behind by seekers, a shell, a scrap of sea glass, a coin. Each token feels like a letter in an ongoing correspondence between human and mythic realms. You place the driftwood at the water's edge and let the waves draw it back, a gentle return of a borrowed story. The gulls will overhead in lazy circles, their calls distant and muted. The sky deepens to indigo, and the first stars shimmer above, the same stars the ancient storytellers used to navigate both sea and narrative. Historians still argue whether the memories held here are metaphors for human emotion or the genuine vestiges of supernatural visitors. Either way, the debate is a testament to the myth's lasting power. A soft mist drifts in, kissing the sand with cool moisture. You lift your gaze to the horizon, where sea and sky blend in seamless obscurity. There, at that boundary, the dragons dwell, in the spaces between breath and breeze, between wave and stone, between waking and dreaming. You step back onto the dunes, letting the world cradle you in its familiar rhythms. The stories you've gathered settle into your mind like smooth pebbles in a pouch, quiet, weighty, and strangely comforting. You turn once more toward the glowing inlet, offering a silent nod of thanks to every creature who shaped these tales. Your boots leave soft impressions in the sand, each step a gentle goodbye. Yet even as you walk away, you know the legends will linger here, waiting in the folds of cliffs and the hush of caves, ready to rise with the next curious traveler. Your eyes feel heavier now, as if the sky itself is tucking them closed. The mist drapes over the shoreline like a soft blanket, muffling every sound to a gentle sigh. You pause on the dunes and let your shoulders relax, releasing the last threads of daylight tension. The world around you softens, the jagged rocks become gentle curves, the crashing waves a lullaby in slow motion, the heather a velvet carpet beneath your feet. Imagine the sea breathing in time with you, slow, unhurried, a deep exhale that carries away every lingering worry. Feel the weight of the world lift, carried on each crest of surf. The air tastes faintly of salt and calm, as if the ocean offers you its own peaceful heartbeat. There is no rush here, only intervals of gentle rhythm guiding you toward rest. Close your eyes and listen, a distant gull, a soft rustle of grasses, a hushed ripple of water sliding back into the sea. These sounds blend into a soothing melody that resonates through your bones. You feel the warmth of the sand beneath your toes and the cool whisper of sea mist on your skin. Each breath draws in serenity, each exhale releases thought. Let your mind drift on the tide of these stories, carrying you to hidden coves and silent grottos where dragons sleep beneath stone arches and the ocean's memory hums with ancient magic. There is comfort in knowing these legends endure, gentle companions in the quiet hours. They offer their presence without demand, their mysteries without pressure. Now, as you prepare to drift off, carry this tranquility with you. Allow the whispering waves and the memory of watching carved stones return to stillness to guide your dreams. Rest in the knowledge that the sea's stories, and your own, are part of something vast and timeless. Let the hush of the coastal night cradle you, coaxing you toward deep, untroubled sleep.